In the winter of 1924, a young trapper named Eli Tatum was working a fox line along Sourwood Ridge in the Tennessee mountains when he found blood in the snow that was not his own. Something had been shot and left to bleed out, and somewhere close, hurt and hungry, it was still moving. What kept him standing that morning was not the rifle on his shoulder. It was something small enough to fit in a closed fist, and you have probably never heard its name. 25 forgotten tools carried hunters through winters that would kill most outdoorsmen today in a single night. Number 12 on this list helped inspire an invention that still powers half the engines on the road. Number 10 was built by a religious commune, so strange that historians still argue about what actually happened behind its walls. By the time we reach number 1, you will understand why a man raised in these mountains never feared getting lost. Subscribe before we start, because once you see what these men carried, a modern hunting pack will look almost embarrassing by comparison. Let's count them down. Number 25. Long before lighters clicked open in every pocket, a mountain hunter trusted his fire to a small brass cylinder, no longer than his thumb. This was the waterproof match safe, threaded at the cap and sealed with a rubber gasket so tight that a man could fall through river ice and still strike a dry match an hour later. A company out of Gladstone, Michigan, built one of the most trusted versions on the market, selling them through hardware catalogs for pocket change at the turn of the century. The brass warmed in a closed hand and rattled faintly with the matches sealed inside it, a small sound a man learned to listen for without thinking. Hunters layered them with a folded scrap of sandpaper tucked alongside the matches, so a striking surface was always within reach even after the original wore smooth. A hunter who kept his matches dry kept his fire alive, and a man's fire was often the only thing standing between him and a night he would not survive. Nobody outlawed the match safe. It simply disappeared into a drawer the day disposable lighters made dry matches feel like a relic. Number 24. Before nylon cord hung from every hardware aisle, mountain men carried a coil of black, tar-soaked line, wound flat around a wooden card. Tarred bank line was thin enough to set a dozen snares and strong enough to hoist a field-dressed deer off the ground without snapping. The pine tar made it rot-resistant and silent in wet weather, holding a knot when ordinary cotton string would slip loose in the rain, and a hunter often re-waxed his own line by hand over a low fire to keep it pliable through a hard winter. Commercial fishing suppliers sold it by the hank for a dime or so before either World War, and it left a dark, resin-smelling stain on a man's fingers that never quite washed off. A hunter who carried bank line never lacked a way to bind, hang, or trap, and a length of it tucked into a coat lining could turn a snapped bootlace or a torn pack strap from a disaster into a minor inconvenience. It broke no laws and offended no one. It just quietly vanished the day cords started coming pre-braided and brightly colored on a spool. Number 23. Splitting a deer's pelvis or driving through frozen kindling called for a tool nobody hunts without today, and it was not an axe. The fro-edged splitting knife was a heavy single-bevel blade, thick at the spine, forged by countryside blacksmiths across the southern mountains and driven through bone and wood alike with a baton of green oak. A hunter quartered a carcass, split fire shavings, and threw sparks off the squared spine, all with the same blade, and a good one was sharpened so rarely that owning a whetstone for anything else felt almost unnecessary. These knives traveled west by the crate from cutlery works, built to outproduce their English rivals, and a finished one cost less than a day's wage. The steel rang dull and heavy when it bit into seasoned wood, a sound entirely different from the higher ring of a thinner blade. No statute ever touched it. The folding pocket knife simply made the old splitting blade look like something pulled from another century. Number 22. A hunter could carry this next tool through any county in the mountains, and not one warden would look at him twice. The turkey wingbone caul was built from 3 hollow bones of a wild turkey's wing, fitted together and sealed with pine pitch, producing the exact cluck and yelp of a hen pulling a wary gobbler into range at dawn. Cherokee hunters were calling birds this way for centuries before any settler copied the method, and a good one cost a man nothing but a bird he had already taken, the bones cleaned, dried, and tuned by trial and error, until the pitch sounded right against the cold morning air. Drawn through cold lips, it made a thin, raspy whisper, sharp enough to carry across a hollow, and a skilled caller could imitate everything from a soft, contented cluck to the sharp, urgent yelp of a hen separated from her flock. A man who could run one fed his family in spring when almost nothing else was moving. No law ever bothered the wingbone. The plastic box call simply buried it under a century of catalog pages. Number 21. Not a blade, not a weapon. The whetstone may have been the single most used tool a mountain hunter ever owned. The best ones were cut from novaculite, a fine, glassy stone quarried out of the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas, smooth on one face and coarse on the other, carried in a leather slip worn soft by years in a coat pocket. A dull knife wasted a hide and exhausted the man holding it. A sharp one moved through joint and tendon, like the work cost nothing at all, and a hunter judged the quality of his own work that evening almost entirely by how little effort the blade had taken that morning. The stone made a wet, hissing sound when a man spat on it and drew his blade across in firelight, and other hunters judged a man by the edge he kept, sometimes testing a borrowed knife against their own thumbnail before saying a word about it. No legislature ever regulated a sharpening stone. The diamond plate simply ended 1,000 years of men reading a blade's edge by the sound it made against rock. Number 20. When early snow pushed game deep into the laurel thickets, a length of rawhide and a bent sapling became a trap in under a minute. The Paiute deadfall used 4 carved sticks to balance a flat stone over a baited platform, so that the moment a rabbit or possum touched the bait, the trigger collapsed and the stone dropped. A hunter could set a line of 20 before dark and walk it again at sunrise, the sticks clacking sharply whenever a trigger let go in the night, often the only sound in an otherwise silent hollow. It cost nothing and weighed nothing because it was carved fresh from whatever the woods offered, which meant a man caught without a single tool in his pocket could still build a working trap before sundown. A family that ran a trap line ate through winters that starved the unprepared. The deadfall was never banned for the woodsman, only for the commercial market hunter. The grocery store simply made the skill feel like an old man's story. Number 19. Here is where the list takes a strange turn, because this entry belonged almost entirely to the women of the mountains. The snare hook was a short curved length of bent steel on a worn hickory handle, used to reach into a den or hollow log and draw a rabbit or groundhog out by the hind leg. It looked no more dangerous than a sewing tool. And that was exactly the point, since a tool that drew no attention, drew no questions either. A woman checking a fence line could bring home dinner without a gun and without a sound, the hook scraping faintly along the dirt before it found its mark, and a practiced hand could clear 3 or 4 burrows on the walk between the house and the spring house. Families ate while the men were away in the mines or timber camps, fed by a tool no lawmaker ever thought to name because no lawmaker ever imagined a woman needed one. It disappeared along with the generation that fed its households straight off the land. Number 18. Introduced at the close of the 19th century, a small folding hatchet became the defining belt tool of the serious mountain hunter almost overnight. Its hinged steel guard folded over the blade and locked shut, letting a man carry a razor-sharp axe against his hip without splitting his own thigh on a bad fall, something that had injured more than a few careless hunters before the design existed. 1.5 pounds of forged steel on a hickory handle could limb a buck, split firewood, and drive tent stakes, all from one tool that rode safely all day long. The guard snapped shut with a flat, final click that every mountain boy learned to recognize by feel, usually long before he was trusted with the axe unsupervised. No law ever restricted it. The lightweight modern camp hatchet simply turned a once essential design into a collector's curiosity. Number 17. Hanging a deer to cool properly required more than a length of rope. The gambrel and skinning hook paired a notched wooden spreader with an iron hook, the spreader holding the hind legs apart, while the hook bit into the gambrel tendon and took the animal's full weight, freeing both of a hunter's hands for the actual work of skinning. Local blacksmiths forged them, or farm catalogs sold them for a few dimes. And the iron wore bright at the hook from 1,000 carcasses over the years, the wood of the spreader darkening with the same use. It clanked softly against a belt buckle with every step downhill, a small settled sound that told a man his gear was where it belonged. A hunter who owned a good gambrel never had to ask a neighbor for help hanging his kill. The tool itself was never outlawed. The commercial meat locker simply ended the era when every family hung and cured its own meat at home. Number 16. A smooth river stone sewn into a leather pocket on a short braided thong let mountain boys take squirrels and rabbits without spending a precious rifle cartridge or spooking an entire hollow with a gunshot. Light enough to ride in a hip pocket, heavy enough to drop a treed squirrel cleanly, the hunting slingshot made a faint whir through cold air before the dull thud of impact, and a boy who practiced daily could put a stone within inches of a target at 20 paces by the time he was old enough to carry a rifle. A family that could not spare gunpowder still put meat on the table because a child had learned to throw straight. And this is the one entry where the law actually stepped in, because the same tool that fed a family could just as easily be turned on a man. By the 1920s, slingshots were banned or heavily restricted in a number of states, and overnight, a child's hunting tool became, in the wrong hands, a criminal offense. Number 15. Sometimes called a possum belt, this wide leather strap, fitted with iron rings, let a hunter turn his own waist into a way to haul game out of deep timber. Rabbits, squirrels, and grouse hung from the rings against his hip, freeing both hands for the climb and the rifle, the weight distributed evenly enough that a man barely noticed it after the first mile. Riveted brass rings spaced a hand's width apart sold through mail-order catalogs for under $1, and a man could walk out of the mountains with 20 pounds of meat without once setting down his gun. The wet game thumped softly against his leg with every downhill step, a rhythm a man got used to without ever really hearing it anymore. A loaded game belt told an entire valley that a man could feed his family off the ridges alone. No law ever touched the belt. The plastic game bag and the pickup truck simply ended the long walk out on foot. Number 14. Brace yourself, because this next one rarely gets the credit it deserves. The snakebite kit, with its small rubber suction cups, a lancet, and a tourniquet cord, may have saved more lives in the deep timber than any rifle a hunter ever carried, because a copperhead hidden in the laurel killed more woodsmen than any bear did. A man cut, drew, and bound a bite hours from the nearest doctor, carrying the kit in a coat pocket through snake country that other men simply avoided, and the act of carrying one was often enough to settle a man's nerves on a hot afternoon, even if he never had to open it. These kits were mass-produced and sold for pocket change well into the 20th century, riding in millions of hunting coats. Eventually, the medical community concluded that the cut and suck method did more harm than good, and the kit was quietly pulled from store shelves. A tool that once defined backcountry nerve became a museum piece almost overnight. Number 13. This was not a fishing reel. The handline gauge and trotline winder was a flat wooden frame wound with tarred cord and fitted with a row of sharpened bone or steel slivers, set across a creek so a hunter could take fish while he worked the ridges above. A gauge lodged sideways in a fish's throat the moment the line drew tight, a far simpler mechanism than a hook, but every bit as effective once a fish swallowed it. A man baited a dozen hooks at dusk, climbed to his deer stand for the evening, and came down in the dark to a string of catfish waiting in the water, the line tugging faintly against the frame as he wound it in by feel rather than sight. Native fishermen used bone gauges for this purpose long before steel ever arrived in the mountains, and the whole rig cost a hunter little more than an evening's whittling. A woodsman who fished while he hunted rarely came home with empty hands. Most states eventually limited trot lines to a handful of hooks per person, turning something that once fed a family freely into a tangle of permits. Number 12. A hunter could carry fire into the wettest woods in the mountains and still make flame after every match he owned had turned to paste. The fire piston was a sealed cylinder, brass, horn, or carved antler, fitted with a tight piston that compressed air so fast and so hard that a single sharp push of the palm ignited a pinch of charred cloth in less than a second. The principle traveled out of Southeast Asia, where it had been used for centuries to light tinder, pipes, and cooking fires in regions too humid for flint and steel to work reliably, the device making a hard pop and a hiss of compressed air with every use. And here is the part almost nobody connects to a hunting tool. A German engineer named Rudolf Diesel reportedly watched someone use a fire piston to light a cigarette, and the idea of compressing air hard enough to generate ignition heat stayed with him. That observation helped lead him toward the compression ignition engine that still bears his name and still powers a huge share of the trucks and machines running today. A mountain hunter's fire-starting tool and the diesel engine trace back to the exact same physical principle, which means somewhere in the history of every diesel pickup parked outside a hunting cabin is a small brass tube that once rode in a coat pocket. No law ever touched the fire piston. The waterproof match and the windproof lighter simply made the cleverest fire tool in the woods feel obsolete. Number 11. Before headlamps clipped onto every cap, mountain hunters carried a small tin lantern fitted with a single magnifying lens that threw a hard, narrow beam into total darkness. A candle or oil flame the size of a coffee tin, gathered by a bulging glass lens into a shaft of light. A man aimed almost like a rifle. Let a hunter following hounds at midnight catch the shine of an animal's eyes from 40 yards out. Pressed tin construction with a folding handle and a sliding shutter to kill the light instantly sold for a quarter through outdoor catalogs in the 1890s. The hot metal ticking as it cooled and smelling of scorched oil, a smell most mountain boys associated with their first nighttime hunt. No law ever banned the lantern itself, though using its beam to freeze a deer in place after dark was eventually outlawed across most of the mountains. The pocket flashlight simply ended several centuries of hunting by candlelight. Number 10. Now here is where the story gets genuinely strange. The long spring steel trap that put hard cash into a mountain family's hand through a brutal winter was manufactured, of all places, by a religious commune in upstate New York. A blacksmith named Newhouse had been hand-forging traps since his teenage years when, in the late 1840s, he joined a community built around the radical preaching of a man named John Humphrey Noyes, who believed in something he called complex marriage and ran the group more like a single extended household than a town. The community mechanized Newhouse's trap design, and within a few decades they were producing hundreds of thousands of traps a year, eventually becoming the largest trap manufacturer on earth and supplying the Hudson's Bay Company itself, the same operation that financed the commune's entire way of life. A trapper could run a line of 50 traps along the creeks and sell cured pelts to a traveling buyer twice a season, the jaws snapping shut with a flat iron crack that echoed off frozen water. The same hands that built a fur trade empire were living inside one of the strangest social experiments in American history, and most hunters who ever set a Newhouse trap never knew it, never imagining that the steel under their boot had been forged inside a community trying, in its own way, to reinvent the entire idea of family. Licenses, seasons, and outright bans on certain sets eventually wrapped trapping in regulation that the original trap line never needed. Number 9. Every hunter who ever sat through a freezing dawn stand owned a hand warmer, and every one of them knew it was the difference between an hour in the timber and a full day. A flat brass box packed with a stick of slow-smoldering charcoal slid into a coat or glove, covered by a felt bag so the warm metal never scorched skin, with a single charge of fuel burning a gentle heat for roughly 8 hours, just long enough to outlast most cold mornings entirely. Imported designs from Japan and domestic versions both sold through sporting catalogs for around $1 in the 1920s, the brass growing warm and faintly smoky in a closed fist. A man with a working trigger hand could shoot when a frozen hunter could only watch his chance walk away, and more than one missed buck was blamed afterward on hands that simply would not close around a trigger anymore. No law ever touched the hand warmer. The disposable chemical packet you crack once and throw away simply replaced a tool a man once carried for a lifetime. Number 8. Stop, because this next one breaks the pattern of this whole list. The Barlow knife was the universal pocket knife of the southern mountains. But in a hunter's hand, it became the most important tool he owned. A long oval bolster, one or two carbon steel blades, and a handle of bone or wood worn the color of an old saddle made it cheap enough for any working man and tough enough to outlast him. A hunter skinned game, whittled trap triggers, cut bank line, and ate his dinner, all with the same blade, often carrying it for so many years that the closed shape of it wore a faint groove into the lining of his pocket. The design traces back to a cutler named Obadiah Barlow in Sheffield, England, in the late 1600s, and an American manufacturer later mass-produced it for pennies. The knife earned a strange kind of fame far beyond hunting camps. George Washington reportedly carried one given to him as a boy, and Mark Twain wrote it directly into the pockets of Tom Sawyer, cementing it as one of the most quietly iconic objects in American folklore. An object that somehow connects a founding father, a literary classic, and a deer camp on the same southern ridge. The blade closed with a solid, oily snap that every mountain boy knew by feel. The knife itself was never outlawed, but modern blade length and lock-in mechanism laws slowly boxed it in. A tool that once rode in every schoolboy's pocket would empty a schoolyard today. Number 7. A hardened steel point set into a wooden grip, threaded with sinew or waxed cord, saved more hunts from disaster than almost any tool on this list. The pack and hide repair all let a hunter stitch torn boots, ripped packs, and split harness leather miles from the nearest town. He punched a hole through wet leather, drew the thread through behind it, and a failing boot held for another 40 miles of hard walking, often patched by firelight while the rest of camp slept. Harness makers and saddlers sold these for a few cents apiece around 1910, the awl popping softly as it pierced leather, followed by the long steady draw of the thread. A man who could mend his own gear never had to turn back early over a busted strap. No statute ever regulated a sewing awl. The disposable boot and the modern nylon pack simply ended the age when a hunter repaired everything he owned by hand. Number 6. A hunter could carry a deer grunt tube through any county in these mountains, and nobody gave it a second look. Carved from river cane or turned cedar and fitted with a thin rubber reed, it produced the low, guttural grunt of a rutting buck and the softer bleat of a doe. Sitting downwind in November, a man could pull a heavy, racked buck across 2 entire ridges using nothing but sound, watching the animal stop, raise its head, and turn toward a noise that should have meant nothing to it. An Illinois manufacturer produced some of the first mass-market versions of these game calls in the 1930s for around 50 cents. The cane cool and smooth against the lips, the reed buzzing faintly between calls. A man who could talk to the game took bucks that other hunters never even saw. No law ever touched the simple grunt tube. The electronic caller, eventually banned in most states for working too well, made the old cane tube feel like a quaint relic almost overnight. Number 5. The flint and steel striker, a shaped bar of high carbon steel raked hard against a sharp piece of flint, was the working fire tool of the mountains for roughly 2 centuries. Carried in a small tin alongside flint and a wad of charred cloth in a waxed pouch, a hunter struck a hard downward stroke, caught the spark in the char, and breathed it into flame inside a nest of dry bark. A skill that took most boys an entire season of failed attempts to master properly. Forged into a C shape that fit comfortably around the knuckles and sold for a few cents through general stores, the steel rang a bright, high note with every strike and smelled of hot metal and scorched cloth. A man who could make fire with steel never depended on anything he couldn't carry forever. The law never bothered the flint and steel. The friction match simply made a 200-year skill feel like a parlor trick. Number 4. Smaller and at close range, far deadlier than any rifle in thick timber. The cap and ball belt pistol rode in a mountain hunter's coat as the finishing tool for wounded game and the last resort against a charging boar. A short, single-shot percussion pistol loaded with loose powder, a patched ball, and a copper cap. These were made by countless gunsmiths across the southern states, often for a few dollars, well within reach of a working man's wages. A hunter who finished a wounded deer at arm's length never risked it bolting into a laurel thicket to die unfound, a fate that could cost a family an entire winter's worth of meat. The hammer fell with a heavy oiled click before the crack and the curl of white smoke. A man with a sidearm in the timber typically walked out with both his game and his own hide intact. The percussion pistol slid first into obsolescence as cartridge firearms took over, then into a thicket of permits and concealed carry law. What once rode openly in a coat now requires paperwork in nearly every state. Number 3. This is the one almost nobody gets right anymore. Number 3 was once the most ordinary tool in these mountains, so common that a man caught without one was considered a fool rather than a minimalist. Yet most hunters today have never even heard its name. The priming horn and measure was a small carved cattle horn that held a full day's gunpowder paired with a calibrated copper measure that threw the exact same charge every single time. A hunter could load by feel in the dark, in rain, with numb hands, and still have his rifle fire to the same point of aim all season long, a kind of consistency that modern shooters rarely have to think about at all, made from a yearling's horn scraped translucent and plugged with carved hardwood. It cost a man little more than an evening's patient work, the powder hissing faintly as it slid from spout to measure. No law ever named the powder horn directly. The self-contained metallic cartridge simply ended an entire craft within a single generation, and the word itself slipped quietly out of everyday memory. Number 2. When a hunter found himself caught on a far ridge with the storm closing in, a wool blanket and a length of leather strap became a shelter in under 2 minutes. The blanket roll and tumpline wrapped a single heavy wool blanket around a man's spare gear, slung across the chest and forehead by a wide leather band that carried the load on the spine and skull instead of the arms, leaving both hands free for the climb. A hunter unrolled it into a lean-to against a fallen tree and slept dry through a night that would have killed a less prepared man, the wool holding warmth even after it had soaked through completely, something cotton could never manage. A well-made wool trade blanket cost several dollars in the 1890s and could easily last 40 years of hard use, the wet wool smelling of lanolin and wood smoke. A man with a blanket roll feared no nightfall on the mountain. No law ever touched it. The modern nylon tent and synthetic sleeping bag simply ended the age of the woolen woodsman. Number 1. Not the rifle, not the knife, but a small brass compass and the knowledge of how to actually read the land around it. This was the one thing a father pressed into a boy's hand before sending him out on his first solo hunt. A brass-cased pocket compass, no bigger than a pocket watch, meant little on its own. What gave it power was a lifetime of memorized ridgelines, creek crossings, and bald summits passed down from elders who had walked that same country 100 times before, until the needle became less of an instrument and more of a confirmation of something the man already half knew. A hunter who could read a compass against the actual shape of the land never stayed lost in country that swallowed careless strangers whole. These compasses, sold for pocket change through hardware catalogs around 1910, and frequently outlived the men who carried them, the lid snapping open with a small brass click in the silence of deep timber. No law ever touched the compass. The glowing screen in every pocket today simply ended 10,000 years of men finding their way home by memory and instinct alone. These 25 tools share one quiet truth. Every single one of them kept a mountain family alive at some point, and almost none of them survive in a hunter's pack today. History remembers the Barlow knife and the belt pistol because catalogs and collectors wrote them down for us. The wingbone call, the fire piston, the priming horn, and the tarred bank line came far closer to disappearing without a trace, because the men and women who mastered them never imagined a day when everyone in the hollow wouldn't already know exactly what they were for. So go check your grandfather's old hunting coat. Open that tin box on the shelf in the barn that nobody has touched since he passed. You might find something from this list sitting quietly in the dark, and you might be the last person alive who actually knows what it was built to do. The tools changed. The mountain never did. Somewhere on a far ridge, the kind of knowledge your great-grandfather carried without a single screen in his hand is still waiting for someone to come back and pick it up